It was one of those serendipitous moments when I opened my Sports Illustrated and saw across a two-page heading the title of my message. And by the way, I had placed it in before I saw that. The article read, "I did it my way," and it was a two-page spread about David Stern, the 30-year tenure of the NBA commissioner. What I found interesting about it was that it said that he was no Mr. Congeniality, and that because of the prosperity and not the tranquility of his reign was the reason he was able to sustain those 3 decades. One of the owners said about him, he ruled by consensus, but he always made sure he had a consensus. Doing it our way is exhausting, I've just got to tell you. Doing it our way is utterly exhausting. Most of us heard the song made famous by Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley. And for those of you who watched the game of the year over the weekend, you saw Mr. Charles Barkley killed it by karaoke when he attempted his own version of it, although most of us do not now even recognize that this song was not written by either one of the folks who made it famous, but rather by a certain Paul Anka. But the lyrics are even worse than I had imagined. I mean, I've heard the song. I've even had it played at funerals, if you can imagine that. But listen to some of these lyrics. "And now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. My friend, I say it clear. I'll state my case, of which I'm certain. I've lived a life that's full. I've traveled each and every highway, but more and more than this, I did it my way. Regrets, I've had a few. Well, I'm glad he's human. But then again, too few to mention. I did what I had to do and saw it through without exception. I planned each charted course, each careful step along the byway, but much more than this, I did it my way. Yes, there were some times, I'm sure you knew, when I bit off more than I could chew, but through it all, when there was doubt, I ate it and spit it out." I'm not making this up. "I faced it all and I stood tall. Yes, I did it my way. I've loved, I've laughed and cried. I've had my fill, my share of losing. And now, as tears subside, I find it all so amusing to think that I did all that, and may I say, not in a shy way. Really? No, oh no, not me. I did it my way." It's even worse. "For what is a man, what has he got? If not himself, then he has naught. To say the things he truly feels, and not the words of one who kneels. The record shows I took the blows, and I did it my way." My friends, doing it your way is absolutely exhausting. It is. Go back to somebody you know who does it their way and who looks into their life, and I want to ask you, how exhausted are they from doing it their way? It was the 1967 parole hearings man. In the movie Shawshank Redemption, you may remember this conversation. I had to delete certain sections. Ellis Boyd Redding, "Your files say that you have served 40 years of a life sentence. Do you feel like you have been rehabilitated?" Red, you'll remember, says, "Rehabilitated? Well, now let me see. You know, I don't have any idea what that means." 1967 parole hearing man says, "Well, it means that you're ready to rejoin society." And Red says, "I know what you think it means, Sonny. To me, it's just a made-up word, a politician's word, so young fellas like you can dress up and wear a suit and a tie and have a job. What do you really want to know? Am I sorry for what I did?" The parole man says, "Well, are you?" And Red says, "There is not a day goes by that I don't feel regret. Not because I'm here, because you think I should. I look back on the way that I was then, a young, stupid kid who committed that terrible crime, and I want to talk to him. I want to try to talk some sense into him and to tell him the way things are. But I can't. That kid's long gone, and this old man is all that's left. And I got to live with that. And that, my friends, is reflections of a man who did it his way and got it all wrong. Doing it our way is absolutely exhausting. The late Shirley Temple Black died just last month. If you know anything about her life, and I knew a little but have read a lot, you know that she died at age 85 in her Woodside, California home. For youngsters of you who've never heard that name, let me remind you, she was the dimpled, precocious, and determined little girl who in the 1930s sang and tap danced her way into the height of Hollywood stardom. Worldwide fame that no other child has ever known as an actor. After 23 motion pictures, she was America's darling during the Depression years. She retired from the screen. Do you remember what age? She retired from the screen at age 22. She resurfaced in the 1960s and held the position of a diplomat, if you can imagine that. But what I found interesting about the article that I read was someone had asked her why she left the screen so soon, and her answer was, I had enough of pretending. I wish I could communicate that to everybody I know. Because too many of us spend too much of our lives living in some kind of world that is pretending. We stand up and grab our lives and say, I'm going to do it my way. And we pretend that we really can do that. And then we fall in an exhausted heap somewhere along the way and recognize it's not possible. Doing it our way is absolutely exhausting. Narcissist. Beautiful youth who in classical mythology looks in and sees his reflection in a pool and literally is unable to tear himself away. And so he captures his image in the reflection of the pool and spends the rest of his life wasted away and dying. I could go on, couldn't I? Because so much of this doing it our way is a theme of our time. Robert Bellah recognized in his book, Habits of the Heart, where he traces the impact of individualism and how it has scattered and splintered the world in which we live in. And now we live in private little worlds, not public worlds. And he says because of that, we've lost our sense of duty to one another. I had hoped that 9/11 would change all that, but it doesn't seem to have done that. So let me take you over to a place in the Bible that does. I'm going to be reading, it's not on the, going to be on the screen, but it's from chapter 3 of Genesis. I'm going to be reading from the Message version because it kind of has an interesting flow to it. And what I want to do here is ask you to enter in and to see if in that you can see in the story what I would call the slippery slide to selfishness. See if you can find it in there. The serpent was clever, more clever than any wild animal God had made. He spoke to the woman, "Do I understand that God told you not to eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "Not at all. We eat from the trees in the garden. It's only the tree in the middle of the garden that God had said, don't eat from it, don't even touch it, or you'll die." And the serpent told the woman, "You won't die. God knows at the moment that you eat from the tree, you will see what's really going on. You'll be just like God, knowing everything, ranging all the way from good to evil." Wasn't that a great beginning illustration that Jenna gave a moment ago? When the woman saw that the tree looked like a good eating and realized that what she would get out of it, she knew everything. She took and she ate the fruit. She gave to her husband and he ate, and immediately the two of them saw what's really going on. And they saw themselves naked, and they sewed fig leaves to make shift clothes. When they heard the sound of God strolling in the garden in the evening breeze, the man and his wife hid in the trees of the garden and hid from God. And God called to the man, "Where are you?" And he said, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid." Doing it our way is absolutely exhausting. The slippery slide to selfishness, if you want to follow along in your outline this morning, we're going to move fairly quickly. The slippery slide includes, first of all, self-awareness that then leads to self-concern and then leads to self-obsession. Let's walk through that a moment. Self-awareness, it's the ability to choose. We are aware of what's going on around us. You will notice it in children. They will suddenly be aware of what's around them. It's interesting to stand near the hallway of the children going down to the nursery, and you can almost say what stage they're in when they make it down through there. I observed one this morning who thought the world had been created for her. She had not a thought on her mind. Everything was for her. She was just in the moment of that. There was no real self-awareness because she was just hanging out that the world that had been created for her. But there is that moment when we begin to be self-aware and have the ability to make clear choices. And then we become self-concerned. And you saw it in the story. They traded in knowledge for trust. I don't need trust. I want knowledge. I want to be able to control my life. And so they traded in trust for knowledge. We do it all the time, don't we? Lord, I know better than you. I'm not going to trust you with this. I know better than you. We trade in fear for freedom, don't we? We trade in our freedom for the fear that we get after that. And that's where we have self-concern. Instead of fear, we trade it for freedom. The worst of it, and really the wallowing in selfishness, comes when we become self-obsessed. That's when the fear of our lives begins to run rampant. And the ending result of this slide into selfishness is a desire to hide. I like how one commentator talks about this passage. He says it very well. Forced out of hiding, Adam stands shamefacedly before the judge and mumbles his reply. These are the first recorded words of a sinner. Note how he communicates. He mixes truth, "I was afraid," with half-truth, "because I was naked." I hate to tell you, but you were always naked. The full truth was that he had disobeyed God and thus was aware of his nakedness. He did not level with God. He concealed his act of willful disobedience instead of openly and honestly confessing. Adam can no longer function as a completely authentic person. Now, I would love to tell you that through life, that there's only one moment in time, usually between 2 and 4, the ages of 2 and 4, that we experience that. That movement from self-concern to self-obsession. But the fact is, I don't care what age you are, there will be moments in your life because of circumstances that are surrounding your life or situations that you find yourself in that you will, in fact, lean back in to selfishness. It can just happen so quickly. Leonard Bernstein, the famous orchestra conductor, was once asked, what was the most difficult instrument to play? You know what his response was? Easily, second fiddle. It's easily identified as second fiddle. He says, I can get plenty of first violinists, but no one wants to play second violin with as much enthusiasm, or second French horn, or second flute. Now that's a problem, and if no one plays second, we have no harmony. The slippery slide to selfishness is followed by the careful climb to what I hope is for you self-esteem. Self-esteem is not a nasty word to me. It's a nice word. It's a good word. Appropriately understood, it is an incredibly powerful word because the careful climb to healthy self-esteem will in fact include some things. It will include self-esteem. But self-esteem will not completely separate us from selfishness. I've been in this skin long enough to know that becoming a believer does not automatically erase the presence of selfishness in my life. I would love to tell you that that's the case, that selfishness was something I gave up as a child, but it sneaks and creeps back into our lives, and it expresses itself in this desire to say and to live, I did it my way. I will tell you a story this morning about somebody that I know incredibly well. And every time they get close to Christ and feel His presence, they are overwhelmed by the power of God in their lives, and then they creep back into their own life like the toxic poison that creeps back into their life. They can't get enough of my relationship with them and how we enjoy fellowship. And the moment that toxic poison creeps back into their life, they don't answer my text messages. They don't answer my emails. They disappear from my life. And they'll resurface again when they seemingly get it all together. But they just come and go. They go do it their way, and then they come back. And I, for some reason, because of my relationship with them, when they're doing it God's way, they want me in their life, and when they're not, they don't want me there. Wilbur Reese said it best. He says, I would like to buy $3 worth of God. I want to buy $3 worth of God, not enough to explode my soul or to disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a warm cup of milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want enough of Him to make me love a black man or pick beets with a migrant. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want the warmth of a womb, not a new birth. I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I would like to buy $3 of God, please. My experience has told me that so many people want enough of God to feel better, but not enough of God to be better. But thanks be to God, we have the jolting journey to freedom. And that's where I hope that all of us have made our way. And we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about when we make our way through selfishness. When we make our way to a genuine understanding of self-esteem that is appropriate, where God is touching our lives in a real way, then we know the incredible power of freedom. Freedom means being able to act and to move and to use our lives without hindrance or restraint. When Jesus talked about it, He said it this way: you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And the word know is personal. It's personal relationship personal. It's based upon Adam knew Eve. It's based upon that kind of intimacy. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And the truth is the starting point for any freedom that you're going to have in your life. You say, well, I'm doing it my way. Well, you're living a lie, because usually doing it your way is living behind closed doors, because you're never going to get it perfectly done. Your way is absolutely exhausting. Jesus said everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin. Now, what does that mean? It means that sin, that separation from God is an inside job that works its way out of you. And that as long as you choose to live it your way, you will be in conflict. You will be in slavery. I read a story recently of a pet snake that was fed a mouse. And I don't want to go into graphics. You can see lots of these things, I understand, on the internet. I looked this up and said, whoa, don't want to see that. But in one case, they forgot that the pet was a pet snake and that he was a small snake, and that the mouse was a big mouse. And you know what happened on that case? The snake didn't win. That's usually not the case. But I went there kind of wondering and thinking about how if sin, separation from God is left unchecked in your life, if you're going to choose to live constantly and consistently doing it your way, you will in fact, sin left unchecked in your life, by the grace of God, it will eat you alive. If you don't check in with the grace of God on a regular basis and find out what that grace really does to your life, undeserved merit, something you can't earn, something you cannot control, something you can't do your way. If you don't check in with that regularly, your life will be lived in a wallow of selfishness. Jesus says, if the Son will make you free, you will be free indeed. So what does this freedom look like? Faith-based freedom, first of all, resolves guilt. Do you know what it's like not to live with guilt? Now, I know there's a good kind of guilt. I'm even of the belief that there's a good kind of shame that our nation does not know anymore because we do reality TV. Did I ever talk to you about how I feel about reality TV? I don't know if I've ever talked to you about that. There is this incredible opportunity to be free. And to be free from guilt is beyond what I could ever have imagined. Now, let me give you some definitions. Conscience is that still small voice that makes us feel even smaller sometimes. Somebody has said it. It's that part of us that screams inside until we quiet it that says you can be more. It's that voice that says you can't really do it your way and not be exhausted. Guilt is the feelings of condemnation from a sense of inadequacy. And the point is simply this. It is a negative reaction to your understanding and to your perspective about the past. Now, I went to somebody that's deeply theological for an answer on this. I went to Charlie Brown and Lucy, and I found in them a very important thing. Lucy is saying to Charlie Brown, as your sister's psychiatrist, I must blame you for her fears. Me? Yes. Each generation must blame the previous generation. It doesn't really solve anything, but it sure makes us feel a lot better. And there's a part of that, I think. You and I have talked about it early in this series where we said blame it on the big guy. There is a sense of all of us that does not want to adequately resolve our guilt by knowing it and owning it. And so we walk around blaming others instead of letting God, in fact, resolve our guilt and experience the freedom that comes from that. You know the childhood story, Pinocchio. Geppetto is carving an old table leg into a little doll, and he is wishing his son, and he's making eyes and arms, and suddenly the arm reaches up and grabs Geppetto's wig, and he says, not even made, and yet you're already a bad boy. And for those of us who know that kind of badness, that kind of off-centeredness, that kind of when am I going to get it right, that kind of guilt that stirs in our lives, it doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't. Some of you are thinking, well, Dan, you don't know where I've been. Yeah, I do. I probably do. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for me, depending on what day of the week it is, I've experienced enough in my experience that most of you are not going to surprise me, and you're certainly not going to surprise God with anything. We are guilty. We are guilty. We are guilty, but we do not and must not be enslaved by it. Secondly, faith-based freedom will build devotion. It will not only resolve guilt, but it will build devotion. It will give you a direction. Now, you know what a fable is. It's a story that's not really true, but I love this story. It's a Persian fable of a prince who, in fact, was a hunchback. And the plan was that he would replace his stately-looking father, who looked like a real king and So this prince was hoping for the best, but with a hunchback, it was awfully hard to stand and to look like the powerful man that his father was. So his idea was that he would have the royal sculptor actually sculpt him, but without his hunchback. So every day he would make his way in, and there he would pull off his outer coat and put his hunchback against that sculptor, with hopes that somehow his back would straighten out, and in the fable, eventually he became like the sculpture. And I will tell you that it is not by effort that we gain this freedom. It is by the eternal that we gain that kind of freedom. Faith-based freedom resolves guilt and it builds devotion, but thanks be to God, it produces possibility. If I could give you $3 of God and $5 of possibility, you could make your way a long way, couldn't you? But not all the way, because God's possibility in your life is the only thing that ultimately will get you off of the exhausting road of doing it your way, of constantly leaning into God and saying, I can't do it my way, I want to do it your way, and I will do it your way because you give me this possibility. Paul says it this way, "Oh, wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of death?" In other words, he keeps dealing with his own sense of, I've tried doing it my way, and it ain't working. He says, thanks be to God through Christ our Lord. There is now no condemnation for those who are, and the most important word in salvation, in Jesus Christ. A divided life does not mean that we have to have a defeated life. And so I thought of the birthright story. I think I told you the initial part of this story probably 2 or 3 years ago. But I pulled it back out of my archives and I remembered it again. I even checked Snopes on this one, and it doesn't line perfectly, but I would believe Fred Craddock more than I would believe Mr. Snopes. Fred Craddock and his wife, Nettie, who now lived, at least when this took place, lived in Oklahoma, they made it back to their favorite place in the Great Smoky Mountains, and they went to dinner outside Gatlinburg near a town called Cosby. And there they went to a restaurant called the Black Bear Inn. I think I've been there, or at least driven by there. But they had a meal, and this elderly man approaches the table and bothers them. I mean, you know, you've been on your vacation. I'm going to be spending some time here in the next little bit. And when I put my ball hat on and I'm in a different place, I don't necessarily want to be contacted by anybody necessarily. So there they are vacationing in the Smoky Mountains, and the gentleman walks up and says, "Good evening, are you on vacation?" And to which he's muttering underneath his breath, "Well, it's really none of your business, but yes." He says, "Where are you all from?" He says, "Well, we're from Oklahoma." He says, "Well, what do you do in Oklahoma?" And he's getting more weary by the minute, Dr. Craddock is. He says, "Well, I'm a Christian minister." And boy, oh boy, was that the wrong answer. He said, "Well, what church did you serve in?" And without question, he said, "The Christian church." He paused and said, "I owe a great deal to a minister of the Christian church." So he pulls up a chair and sits down. And of course, Fred says, "Well, have a seat." And he's thinking to himself, who in the world is this person? And then comes the story. He says, "I grew up in the mountains, and my mother wasn't married, and the whole community knew it. They knew that I was an illegitimate child, and in those days it was a shame. And I was ashamed," he said. "The reproach that fell on her not only hurt her, but it incredibly hurt me as well. When I went through the town," he said, "the people would in fact stare at me and make guesses as to who my father might be. At school, the children would say ugly things to him, and so," he said, "I stayed to myself as often as I could." He says, "I even ate lunch alone most of the time." He says, "Into my early teen years, I began to attend a little church back in the mountains called Laurel Springs Christian Church. He said it had a minister there that was both attractive and frightening. He said he had a chiseled face, a heavy beard, and an incredibly deep voice. And he says, I went to hear him preach because I was just absolutely fascinated by the things that he said. But he always made it careful. He was careful to come in only for the preaching and then to leave as quickly as he possibly could because he didn't want anybody in the church really cornering him. But sure enough, one Sunday he got kind of squirreled up and couldn't get out as fast as he wanted to, and he felt a heavy hand come down on his shoulder, and he immediately knew the minister had caught him. He said, I cut my eyes around and caught the glimpse of his beard and his chin, and I knew it was him. And he turned his face to me so he could see me straight on, and it seemed as though he was staring me into my soul. And I knew what he was going to do. I knew that he was going to look at me and ask me who my father was. And a moment later he said, well, boy, you're a child of... And he paused as though he wasn't quite sure. And then he began again. He says, son, you're a child of God. And he reaches down and smacks him on the bottom and says, now go claim your inheritance. He said my life was changed at that moment. Fred Craddock was so moved by the story, he asks him, he says, what's your name? He said, my name is Ben Hooper. And then he recalled, although somewhat vaguely, he recalled his father talking about a child, as when he was a child, a man who had in fact served the people of Tennessee for 2 terms as governor, and his name was Ben Hooper. He was called the bastard child, who served 2 terms as governor of Tennessee. When I hear that story, and I recognize and live my own story, I get so hopeful that God's birthright into my life can be lived with possibility. I don't want to live a life that says, I did it